was a crisp autumn morning, and the soft rays of the sun peeked through the trees lining Warren Buffett's quiet neighborhood. Outside his sprawling yet modestly designed home, the world seemed calm and orderly. But there, just beyond the iron gates, lay a sight that caught the attention of anyone passing by. A small puppy, curled up in the fallen leaves, fast asleep. Its fur was patchy in places, a mix of golden brown and white, and its tiny frame looked frail, as though it had gone days without a proper meal. Its eyes fluttered open occasionally, scanning the surroundings before closing again, exhausted but determined to stay. This wasn't the first time the puppy had appeared. For the past 3 nights, it had shown up at the exact same spot, settling into the same patch of earth as if it had nowhere else to go. Warren had first noticed the puppy 2 mornings ago, while sipping his coffee by the window. He'd seen it lying there, shivering slightly in the cold. At first he thought it might belong to a neighbor and had simply wandered over. But as the days passed, he realized it wasn't going anywhere. The puppy never barked, never whined. It just stayed there, as if waiting for something. The house staff had begun to talk about it in hushed tones. "It's strange," one of them said. "The little thing doesn't cause any trouble. It's like it's waiting for someone." Warren, known for his sharp mind and kind heart, couldn't help but feel a growing curiosity. He wasn't one to ignore things easily, and the sight of the lonely puppy tugged at something deep within him. That morning, he decided to take a closer look. Setting his coffee cup down, he grabbed his coat and stepped outside, the crisp air biting gently at his skin. As he approached the gate, the puppy stirred, lifting its head to look at him. Its eyes, round and glistening, held an emotion Warren couldn't quite place, something between hope and sadness. He crouched down, his movements slow and careful, not wanting to startle it. "Hey there, little one," he said softly. His voice was calm, almost soothing. The puppy didn't move away, but its small tail wagged ever so slightly. For a moment, Warren simply sat there, studying the tiny creature. Its ribs were faintly visible, and its paws were caked with dirt, signs that it had been wandering for some time. He reached out cautiously, letting the puppy sniff his hand, before gently running his fingers through its fur. It was softer than he expected, but beneath the softness, he could feel the frailty of its body. "You've been here for a while, haven't you?" he murmured, more to himself than to the puppy. The dog responded by leaning into his touch, its small body trembling slightly, but visibly comforted by the contact. As Warren stood to go back inside, he glanced back one last time. The puppy had settled back down, its eyes following him until he disappeared into the house. Something about the encounter stayed with him, a quiet question lingering in his mind. Why here? Why now? But what Warren didn't yet know was that this little dog carried a story far bigger than its tiny frame, a story that would soon unravel in ways no one could have expected. The following morning, Warren found himself drawn back to the window, coffee in hand, his eyes instinctively searching for the tiny figure by the gate. Sure enough, the puppy was there, curled up in the same spot as before. A light drizzle had fallen overnight, leaving the ground damp, and the puppy's fur was matted with specks of mud. Yet, it didn't move, its unwavering presence almost haunting. Warren placed his cup down and headed outside again, this time with a small bowl of water and a piece of toast. As he approached, the puppy's ears perked up, and it wagged its tail faintly, as if recognizing him. "You've got some determination, haven't you?" he said softly, setting the food and water down. The puppy hesitated for a moment before leaning forward, sniffing the bowl. Then, with careful movements, It began to eat, its small bites almost heartbreaking in their quiet desperation. As Warren crouched near it, he noticed something he hadn't seen the day before. Around the puppy's neck was a tattered piece of fabric, a makeshift collar, frayed and barely holding together. His eyes narrowed slightly as he leaned closer to inspect it. There were faint markings on the fabric, letters that had faded with time. He reached out gently, turning the collar to read what was left. The word Buddy was barely legible, stitched in small, uneven letters. Below it, a faint address was scrawled, though most of it was smudged beyond recognition. Warren's mind raced as he studied the collar. This wasn't a stray. It had belonged to someone who had cared enough to give it a name and a collar. But for some reason, it was now here, alone. A voice interrupted his thoughts. Mr. Buffett, one of his staff members, a groundskeeper named Frank, had approached cautiously. "I've seen that dog a few times now," Frank said, glancing at the puppy. "It's strange, isn't it? Always at the same spot, like it's waiting for someone." Warren nodded, his gaze still fixed on the puppy. "It's not just a coincidence," he said quietly. "This little one has a story, and I think we need to find out what it is." That evening, Warren couldn't shake the image of the puppy from his mind. The worn collar and the faded letters weighed heavily on him. He decided to dig deeper, calling Frank into his study. "I want you to take a closer look at that collar tomorrow," Warren said. "See if there's any way we can trace it back to an owner. A lost dog doesn't just appear here without reason." Frank nodded, but his expression held a hint of doubt. "I'll do my best," he said. "But that collar looks like it's been through a lot. It might not lead anywhere." Warren smiled faintly, his determination clear. "Sometimes, even the smallest clues can lead to the biggest answers," he said. "And I have a feeling there's more to this than meets the eye." The next morning, Frank returned with news. "I cleaned up the collar as best I could," he said, handing it to Warren. The faint address was now slightly clearer, though parts of it were still missing. "It's an address in the city," Frank explained, "but it doesn't seem complete. We might have to do some digging to figure out the rest." Warren studied the collar, his curiosity deepening. "Then let's dig," he said simply. That afternoon, Warren found himself driving into the city, the collar sitting on the passenger seat beside him. He couldn't explain it, but something about this tiny dog and its quiet persistence had sparked a need to uncover the truth. As he navigated through the bustling streets, he felt a strange mixture of anticipation and unease, as if the answers he was seeking might change everything. When he arrived at the partial address, he was met with a small, dilapidated house, its windows boarded up and its yard overgrown. It was clear the place had been abandoned for some time. Warren stepped out of the car, the collar in his hand, and approached the house. The silence was heavy, the kind that carried echoes of a story long forgotten. As he stood there, a neighbor approached, an older woman carrying a basket of laundry. "Looking for someone?" she asked, her voice cautious but kind. Warren held up the collar. "Do you know anything about this place, or who might have lived here?" The woman's expression softened as she glanced at the collar. "That belonged to the Johnsons," she said. "They had a little boy who adored his dog, Buddy, but they left months ago, lost their home, couldn't keep up with the payments." Warren's chest tightened as the pieces began to fall into place. The puppy had been left behind, returning to the only place it had ever known, a place it could no longer call home. But why had it ended up outside his house? And what had drawn it to him specifically? Warren knew the answers were only beginning to reveal themselves, and as he headed back to his car, the weight of the story pressed down on him. This was no ordinary dog, and its journey was far from over. Warren drove back to his home, the collar resting on the passenger seat, as if it carried the weight of the story he had only begun to uncover. His mind raced with questions. Why had Buddy, the abandoned puppy, chosen his home? Was it just a coincidence, or was there something more profound at play? As the city's lights blurred past him, he resolved to find out. Back at home, Buddy was still by the gate, as if it had never moved. The sight tugged at Warren's heart even more now, knowing the puppy's backstory. He stepped out of the car and approached the dog slowly, crouching down to meet its gaze. "So, Buddy," he said softly, "what are you waiting for?" Buddy wagged its tail faintly, leaning into Warren's touch. There was something almost human in the dog's eyes, an unspoken message that Warren couldn't yet decipher. He carried the puppy inside his home for the first time, setting it gently on a soft blanket near the fireplace. Buddy curled up instantly, its tiny body relaxing in the warmth. The next morning, Warren called Frank into his study. "We've found part of the story," Warren said, holding up the collar. "But there's more to this. I want to find the Johnson family." Frank nodded, though his expression was uncertain. "I'll reach out to some contacts," he said. "It might take a while, but if they're still in the area, someone should know where they are." Days passed, and Buddy began to settle into Warren's home. The dog followed him everywhere, its loyalty unwavering. It seemed to trust him completely now, but there were still moments when Buddy would sit by the window, staring out, as if waiting for someone to return. One evening, as Warren sat by the fire reading, his phone buzzed. It was Frank. "I found something," he said, his tone serious. "The Johnsons are staying in a small shelter on the other side of town. They've been there for a few months, but it's not a permanent solution. They've had a tough time." Warren's heart sank. The thought of a family losing everything, including their home, weighed heavily on him. And yet, the pieces still didn't quite fit. Why had Buddy ended up at his house instead of staying closer to where the Johnsons were now? The question lingered as Warren decided his next step. The following day, Warren drove to the shelter, Buddy sitting on the seat beside him. The dog seemed unusually alert, its ears perked and eyes scanning the surroundings, as if it knew something important was about to happen. When they arrived, Warren carried Buddy inside, the small dog trembling slightly in his arms. The shelter was quiet, the air heavy with the weight of so many lives in limbo. Warren approached the front desk, his voice soft but firm. "I'm looking for the Johnson family," he said. "I believe this dog belongs to them." The woman at the desk hesitated, her eyes flicking to Buddy before nodding. "They're here," she said. "One moment." A few minutes later, a woman and a young boy emerged from a small room down the hall. The boy, no older than 7, looked tired but hopeful, his eyes widening as he spotted Buddy. "Buddy!" he cried, breaking into a run. The puppy squirmed in Warren's arms, barking excitedly as the boy reached them. Warren knelt down, gently setting Buddy on the ground. The dog bolted toward the boy, jumping into his arms and covering his face in frantic licks. The boy laughed, tears streaming down his cheeks as he hugged his long-lost friend. The mother stood nearby, her hands covering her mouth as she watched the reunion. "I thought we'd never see him again," she whispered, her voice breaking. She turned to Warren, her eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you. You have no idea what this means to us." Warren smiled faintly, his heart full at the sight of the reunion. But even as the moment unfolded, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was still more to the story. "Buddy showed up outside my home," he said, his voice thoughtful. "Every day he was there, as if he was waiting for something. Do you have any idea why? The mother looked at him, confusion flickering across her face. Your home? She asked. Where is it? Warren described the address, and her eyes widened. That's where we lived before we lost the house, she said. Buddy must have been trying to go back home. The realization hit Warren like a wave. Buddy hadn't just been waiting. He had been searching. And somehow, the dog had connected his former home with Warren's presence, as if sensing the kindness that now occupied the space. But there was one more question that lingered, a question Warren couldn't ignore. Why had Buddy stayed, even after realizing the family was no longer there? And then, slowly, the boy spoke, his voice soft but clear. He always waited for people who were kind, he said, even when things got bad. Warren's heart clenched at the words, the simple wisdom of a child cutting through the complexity of the moment. This little dog had bridged a gap of loss and hope, waiting for kindness to guide him home. But what Warren didn't know yet was that Buddy's journey wasn't just about the Johnsons. It was about showing Warren himself that sometimes even the smallest acts of compassion could change lives in ways no one could anticipate. Warren sat quietly in his car later that evening, staring at the dimly lit street outside the shelter. Buddy had reunited with the Johnson family, but the pieces of the story still felt incomplete. The boy's words, "He always waited for people who were kind," echoed in his mind. The dog had shown extraordinary loyalty and resilience, but why had it stayed outside his home, of all places? As he drove home, Warren couldn't help but feel a tug of something deeper. He thought about the moments Buddy had spent sitting at his gate, braving the cold and rain, without complaint. It wasn't just loyalty. There was something purposeful about it. But what? The question lingered, refusing to leave. The next morning, Buddy was gone from Warren's home for the first time in days. The Johnsons had taken him back to the shelter, where they planned to move him with them to a temporary housing arrangement. Warren felt a strange emptiness as he sipped his coffee by the window, the sight of the empty gate unsettling. But as the day passed, something unexpected happened. One of Warren's staff, Frank, approached him with an envelope. "Mr. Buffett," he said, his tone careful, "you might want to see this. It was left outside the gate." Warren opened the envelope, his brow furrowing as he pulled out a handwritten note. The message was brief, but chilling. "You don't know what you've stepped into. Leave the dog where it belongs." There was no signature, only an unfamiliar symbol drawn at the bottom, a circle with 3 intersecting lines. His heart raced as he read the note again, the cryptic warning sending a chill down his spine. What did it mean? Who had written it? And why would they care about Buddy? The twist felt surreal, turning a simple story of a lost dog into something far more sinister. Warren handed the note to Frank, his voice steady but firm. "Find out everything you can about this symbol," he said, "and keep an eye on the property. If someone's watching us, I want to know." Frank nodded, his own unease evident as he left the room. Warren leaned back in his chair, staring at the note on his desk. For the first time, the story didn't feel like just a coincidence. It felt orchestrated, as if Buddy's presence at his home wasn't entirely by chance. That evening, Warren drove back to the shelter, the note tucked securely in his pocket. When he arrived, the Johnsons greeted him warmly, Buddy wagging his tail excitedly at the sight of him. Warren knelt to pet the dog, his thoughts racing as he tried to piece together the growing puzzle. He turned to the mother, his tone cautious. "Have you ever received anything strange about Buddy? Notes, threats, anything unusual?" She frowned, shaking her head. "No, never," she said. "Why? Has something happened?" Warren hesitated, then showed her the note. Her face paled as she read it, her hand trembling slightly. "What does this mean?" she whispered. "Who would do this?" The young boy tugged at his mother's sleeve, his voice soft but insistent. "Mom, remember what Dad said before we left the house, about the man who came asking about Buddy?" Warren's gaze sharpened. "What man?" he asked, his voice calm but urgent. The boy looked at him, his small face serious. "A man came to the house a few days before we moved. He wanted to buy Buddy. Dad said no, but the man kept coming back. He said Buddy was special." The room fell silent as the weight of the boy's words settled. Warren exchanged a glance with the mother, both of them realizing there was far more to Buddy's story than they had understood. The dog wasn't just loyal, it was valuable to someone, for reasons they didn't yet know. Warren straightened, his resolve hardening. "I'll get to the bottom of this," he said, his voice firm. "But until we know more, I want you all to stay somewhere safe. I'll take care of Buddy for now." The mother hesitated, her eyes filled with worry. "Are you sure?" she asked. "We don't want to cause you trouble." Warren smiled faintly, kneeling again to scratch behind Buddy's ears. "This little guy found his way to me for a reason," he said. "I'm not about to let him down." As Warren drove back to his home that night, Buddy curled up on the seat beside him. He couldn't shake the feeling that the twists in this story were only just beginning. The cryptic note, the mysterious man, and Buddy's unyielding determination all pointed to something bigger, something Warren was now determined to uncover. As Warren drove home with Buddy nestled beside him, his mind churned with unanswered questions. The cryptic note, the boy's story about the mysterious man, and Buddy's unrelenting presence at his gate all painted a picture that was far more complicated than he'd anticipated. Still, his resolve to protect Buddy and uncover the truth only grew stronger. Back at the house, Warren set Buddy down on the soft blanket by the fireplace, where the dog curled up contentedly. The warmth of the fire seemed to soothe both of them, but Warren's thoughts remained restless. He called Frank into his study once more, showing him the note and explaining what the Johnson boy had shared. Frank's expression darkened as he studied the symbol on the note. "I've seen this before," he said finally, his voice low. "It's connected to an underground group that deals in rare animals. They believe some animals have unique qualities, almost like a superstition. If they wanted Buddy, it wasn't just because he's a dog. They think he's special." Warren's stomach turned at the thought. He looked at Buddy, now fast asleep, and felt a pang of guilt. This little dog had been through so much, and now it was at the center of something far beyond its control. "Get me everything you can on this group," Warren said firmly. "I want to know who they are and why they think Buddy is important." Over the next few days, Frank dug deeper into the group, uncovering more about their activities. They were known for targeting animals they believed brought wealth or good fortune, selling them to high-paying buyers who subscribed to the same beliefs. Buddy, it seemed, had caught their attention for reasons tied to his loyalty and resilience, qualities that aligned with their superstitions. Warren knew he couldn't let Buddy fall into their hands. He contacted the authorities, sharing everything Frank had uncovered. The group's activities were already on their radar, and Buddy's story provided the missing link they needed to act. In the meantime, Warren continued caring for Buddy, who seemed oblivious to the danger surrounding him. The dog's trust in Warren never wavered, and their bond grew stronger with each passing day. One evening, As Warren sat by the fire, Buddy resting at his feet, his phone buzzed. It was the lead investigator working on the case. "We've located the man who was trying to buy the dog," the investigator said. "He's part of the group, and he's cooperating. Thanks to your information, we're shutting down their operation." Relief washed over Warren as he ended the call. The danger had passed, and Buddy was safe. The next morning, he drove back to the shelter to meet the Johnson family. Buddy, as always, wagged his tail excitedly when he saw the little boy, who ran to embrace his loyal friend. "We're moving into a new place soon," the mother said, her smile bright despite the hardships they'd endured. "Thanks to you, Mr. Buffett, we can start over, and Buddy can finally come home." Warren knelt to pet the dog one last time. "You've got a good family," he said softly. "Take care of them, Buddy. They need you." As the family left with Buddy, Warren stood by his car, watching them disappear down the street. His heart felt lighter, knowing the dog had finally found its way back to where it belonged. For Warren, the experience was more than just an unusual story. It was a reminder of the power of loyalty, kindness, and the connections that could arise in the most unexpected ways. And as he returned to his quiet life, he couldn't help but feel grateful for the little dog that had taught him so much. Buddy's journey had come full circle, and so had Warren's understanding of what it meant to protect and cherish life, even the smallest, most unassuming ones.